You have read the word glory hundreds of times in your English Bible, and your mind, almost without permission, does something specific with it. It reaches for light. A bright shining aura. A halo. Something radiant, something luminous. That is what centuries of stained glass and Renaissance paintings and Christmas cards have trained an English-speaking mind to picture the instant the word glory appears on a page. But the Hebrew word sitting underneath that English translation does not mean light. It does not mean brightness. It does not mean radiance at all, at least not at its root. The word is kavod, and its most basic, literal, physical meaning is simply this: heavy. Not heavy like sad. Not heavy like serious, in the modern loose sense. Heavy the way a stone is heavy. Heavy the way a loaded cart is heavy. Heavy enough that in one Old Testament story, it is the exact word used to describe two exhausted arms that will not stay lifted without help. That single shift, from light to weight, is not a minor footnote for Hebrew scholars to argue about in the margins. It rearranges an enormous portion of how the Bible actually wants glory to land on a reader. God's glory filling the temple is not primarily a light show. It is a presence so substantial it becomes physically impossible for priests to stand inside the room. Paul's promise of glory waiting for suffering believers is not a promise of eventual brightness. It is, in his own words, a promise of weight. This is the story of that word, where it comes from, where it shows up. And what changes once you stop picturing glory as something that shines, and start picturing it as something that presses down, fills up, and cannot be ignored. Start with the Hebrew itself, stripped all the way down to its root. The noun is kavod. Its root verb is kaved, and kaved simply means to be heavy. Not metaphorically heavy in every single instance, sometimes it means exactly, physically, literally heavy, full stop. Exodus chapter 17 tells the story of a battle against the Amalekites, where Israel's fortunes rise and fall depending on whether Moses can keep his arms raised over the battlefield. Eventually, the text says plainly, Moses's hands grew heavy, the very same root. Not tired in some vague poetic sense. Heavy, the way any pair of arms held up too long becomes heavy. So heavy that Aaron and Hur have to physically hold his arms up with their own hands until sunset. That is the ordinary, unglamorous, physical sense of the root. But Hebrew does something Hebrew does constantly: it takes an ordinary physical word and lets it carry enormous figurative weight, no pun avoided, into questions of status, honor, and reputation. Think about how English still does something similar, even now. Call someone a heavyweight in their field, and everyone understands you do not mean their literal body mass. You mean they carry influence. They matter. Their presence in a room changes the room. A weighty argument is not one that is difficult to lift, it is one that carries real substance, real consequence, something you cannot brush aside. English speakers already have the instinct for this metaphor. Hebrew simply built its entire vocabulary for honor and reputation directly on top of it. A respected elder, in this framework, is someone whose word carries weight. A person of low honor is, by the same logic, someone who is light, insubstantial, easily dismissed, someone whose presence in the room changes nothing. Kavod, then, is not simply glory in some vague sparkling sense. It is substance. It is significance so real it has heft. It is the opposite of flimsy, the opposite of empty, the opposite of merely decorative. Even the word's usage for physical objects leans this direction. In Psalm 3, David calls the Lord his kavod, his glory, in the very same verse where he calls God his shield. Scholars researching the term note its proximity to a related word for armament, for the solid, weighty defensive gear a soldier straps onto his body before battle. This is not glory as sparkle. This is glory as the substantial thing standing between you and a blade. So when this word, kavod, rooted in weight, rooted in substance, rooted in something too significant to dismiss, becomes the primary word the Hebrew Bible reaches for to describe the very presence of God, the translators handing you the English word glory are not wrong, exactly. But they are asking an English reader's brain, trained on light and radiance, to do something it was never built to do on its own. Modern Hebrew still carries a trace of this old weightiness, even in casual conversation. A common Israeli phrase, kol hakavod, is usually translated loosely as well done or way to go. But its literal meaning is closer to all the honor or all the weight. The idea being that when someone does something genuinely commendable, you are not merely praising a nice gesture. You are acknowledging that their action carried real substance, real weight, something that actually mattered rather than something merely pleasant to watch. Even in ordinary speech, centuries after the temple, the old root has never entirely let go of its original sense. Nowhere does this weight land harder than in the story of Moses asking to see it directly. By this point in Exodus, Moses has already spoken with God face to face, as the text puts it, the way a person speaks to a friend. He has already led Israel out of Egypt, already received the law at Sinai, already interceded for the nation after the disaster of the golden calf. And in Exodus chapter 33, he makes one final, audacious request: please, show me your glory. Show me your kavod. He is not asking for a light show. He already knows what light and thunder and fire look like. He has stood at the base of a smoking, quaking mountain. What he is asking for now is something more total, the full weight, the complete substance, of who God actually is. God's answer is both yes and a careful, protective no. I will make all my goodness pass before you, God tells him. But you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. So God places Moses in the cleft of a rock, and covers him with his own hand, and lets only a passing glimpse, his back, so to speak, go by. Even a partial exposure to this weight requires a rock wall and a divine hand as a buffer. The full kavod, unfiltered, is not survivable contact for an ordinary human body. This pattern, glory as something that must be buffered, contained, approached carefully, repeats at an even larger scale. Once the tabernacle, the portable tent sanctuary Israel carries through the wilderness, is finally completed. Exodus chapter 40 describes the moment the structure is finished and dedicated, a cloud covers the tent, and the glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. And then this detail, easy to read past too quickly, Moses himself, the same man who has spoken with God face to face, was not able to enter the tent, because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Read carefully, that is a striking sentence. This is not a gentle radiance welcoming visitors inside. This is a presence so total, so substantial, that it physically occupies the space and makes entry impossible, even for Moses. Centuries later, the same scene repeats at an even grander scale, when Solomon dedicates the newly built temple in Jerusalem. Fire falls from heaven, consuming the sacrifice on the altar, and the text says the glory of the Lord filled the temple so completely that the priests themselves, men specifically trained, consecrated, and assigned to minister inside that exact room, could not enter to perform their service. Not because they were unworthy in that moment. Because the room, quite simply, was full. There was no space left for a human body to occupy alongside that much kavod. This is what it looks like to take the word's root seriously. Glory here does not illuminate a room the way a lamp does, leaving plenty of open floor for people to walk through. It fills a room the way water fills a cup, displacing everything else, leaving no space unoccupied, becoming the room's entire substance rather than merely its lighting. Even before the tabernacle was finished, this same weighty presence had already been traveling with Israel through the wilderness in visible form. A pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Moving ahead of the camp, settling over it when it was time to stop, and lifting when it was time to move again. The people did not need to wonder where the Kavod was, the entire nation organized its daily movement around the physical location of that presence. It was not a background glow. It was closer to a traveling companion whose position dictated everything else about the camp's life, when to march, when to rest, when it was safe to proceed. If Kavod can fill a room this completely, the Bible also insists it can leave one, and one particular departure is described in agonizing, almost cinematic detail. The prophet Ezekiel writes during the final years before Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonian Empire. The same catastrophe that would later produce the Book of Lamentations. Years before the city actually falls, God gives Ezekiel a vision, and in it, he watches the Kavod of the Lord slowly, deliberately withdraw from the temple. That had once been too full of it for even the priests to enter. The vision unfolds in stages, almost reluctantly. The glory rises from its place above the cherubim inside the inner. It moves to the threshold of the temple. It pauses there. Then it moves further, to the east gate of the temple complex. And finally, in one of the most quietly devastating verses in the entire book, the glory of the Lord goes up from the midst of the city and stops on the mountain to the east of it. Pausing, almost as if reluctant to leave entirely, on the Mount of Olives, looking back one last time at the city it is abandoning. This is not the language of a light simply switching off. It is the language of a weighty, substantial presence physically relocating, packing up, so to speak, and walking out the door. Stage by deliberate stage, as if even the departure itself carries gravity. Not long after this vision, the unthinkable happens. Babylon's armies breach the walls, burn the temple, and the building that once held so much Kavod that priests could not stand inside it now stands empty, then stands in ruins. The weight, Ezekiel's vision insists, had already left before the stones ever fell. But the book does not end there. Decades later, in exile, Ezekiel receives another vision, an elaborate, detailed blueprint for a future, rebuilt temple. And in that vision, the Kavod returns, entering through the very same east gate it had departed from, filling the new house exactly as it once filled the old one. The weight that left in stages comes back in the same deliberate, embodied way it went, not a light flicking back on, but a substantial presence resuming its residence. If Ezekiel shows Kavod arriving and departing like a resident moving through a house, the prophet Isaiah shows what it feels like to be caught directly in the room when it is present at full weight. Isaiah chapter 6 opens with the prophet standing in the temple, in the year Judah's king Uzziah dies, a moment of national uncertainty, a throne suddenly empty. And there, Isaiah sees the Lord seated on a throne, high and lifted up, his robe filling the temple. Around him, seraphim, burning, winged heavenly beings, call to one another in a refrain that has echoed through worship services for millennia since. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his Kavod. The whole earth is full of his glory. Notice what that declaration claims. Not merely that light shines somewhere in the sky. That the entire earth, everywhere, at all times, is all filled, the same way the tabernacle and temple were filled, with this substantial, weighty presence. The seraphim are not describing a decoration hanging somewhere over the world. They are describing the fundamental substance the whole world is soaked in. Whether anyone happens to notice it or not. The effect of standing in a room where that weight becomes momentarily undeniable is immediate and violent. The foundations of the thresholds shake at the sound of the voices. And the temple fills with smoke. And Isaiah's own reaction is not wonder or delight. It is collapse. Woe is me! For I am lost, he cries, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. This is the honest, embodied experience of Kavod at close range, not a pleasant glow warming the skin, but a crushing weight. That exposes exactly how insubstantial, how light, how lacking in true weight a mortal, compromised human being actually is by comparison. Isaiah does not need a physics lesson in what glory means. He needs a burning coal pressed to his lips by one of the seraphim, purging his guilt, before he can even speak again. Only after that cleansing does Isaiah hear the question that will define the rest of his prophetic life: whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And only then can he answer, here am I. Send me. The weight of Kavod does not merely illuminate Isaiah's situation. It flattens him first, and then, having flattened him, makes room for him to be sent. It is worth noticing the order of events here, because it is easy to miss on a quick read. Isaiah is not cleansed and then shown the glory as a reward. The glory arrives first, uninvited, overwhelming, entirely outside his control. And only in the wreckage of that encounter does the cleansing, and then the commissioning, become possible. Weight, in this story, is not the prize at the end of spiritual effort. It is the very thing that has to knock a person down before anything useful can be built back up. Centuries later, a very different kind of writer picks up this exact word and does something almost unthinkable with it. The Gospel of John opens with language deliberately echoing the very beginning of Genesis: in the beginning was the Word. Before arriving, a few verses later, at one of the most compressed, theologically loaded sentences in the entire New Testament, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. The Greek word John uses here, doxa, is the standard translation the ancient Greek Old Testament had already been using for centuries to render Kavod. John's first readers, especially any reader steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, would have heard the full weight of that older word humming underneath the Greek one. This sentence is not simply saying that a bright, shining figure showed up in first-century Judea. It is saying that the same substantial, weighty presence that once filled a tent in the wilderness, that once filled a temple so completely priests could not stand inside it, that once made an entire prophet collapse to the floor, that presence has now taken on ordinary human flesh. And is, in John's own verb, tabernacling among us. Pitching a tent among us. Moving into. This is a staggering claim once the weight of the word is restored to it. The Kavod that Moses could only survive glimpsing from behind, filtered through a rock and a divine hand, is now, John insists, walking through villages, eating meals, weeping at a friend's grave, and washing the feet of ordinary fishermen. The weight has not been diminished to make this possible. It has been, somehow, made approachable without ceasing to be weighed at all. This is also why the transfiguration scene, later in the Gospels, lands with such force. When Jesus is transfigured on the mountain before Peter, James, and John, his face shines like the sun, and his clothes become dazzling white, light imagery, unmistakably, borrowed straight from the older visions of God's Kavod. But the light in that scene is not the whole story, it is the visible edge of something the disciples cannot fully absorb. So overwhelming that Peter starts babbling about building shelters, not entirely sure what he is even saying. The light, in other words, is the spillover. The weight is the substance underneath it. The Apostle Paul, writing decades later, reaches back into this same word with striking deliberateness, in a letter grappling directly with suffering. In his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul first contrasts two covenants using imagery straight out of Moses' story. Recalling how Moses' face shone with reflected glory after speaking with God, so brightly that he had to wear a veil. And how that particular glory, Paul notes, was fading even as Moses wore it. The old covenant's glory, real as it was, had a built-in expiration. The new covenant, Paul argues, carries a far greater, more permanent Kavod. One that does not need a veil, and does not fade. Then, a chapter later, in the middle of describing the very real, ongoing suffering of his own ministry, persecution, hardship, a body he describes as wasting away, Paul writes one of the most compact, carefully constructed sentences in his entire body of work, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Read that sentence with the Hebrew root restored underneath it, and the wordplay becomes almost impossible to miss, even filtered through Greek. Paul sets a light affliction, genuinely light, genuinely momentary. He is not minimizing real suffering, directly against a glory that is, quite literally in his own phrase, light suffering, now. Weighty glory, later. The very structure of the sentence performs the contrast. Paul is not simply offering vague comfort about a distant shining reward. He is promising that whatever a person's suffering costs in substance, in weight, in felt reality, an equivalent and vastly exceeding weight of glory is what waits on the other side of it. This is the same word, doing the same work, that filled a wilderness tent and grounded a prophet to the floor of a temple. Paul has not spiritualized it into something thin. He has kept its full density intact, and pointed it forward, into an ordinary human being's ordinary, exhausting. There is a thread running underneath every one of these scenes. At its root, Kavod is simply the word for heavy, heavy arms held too long over a battlefield, a heavy reputation carried by a respected elder, heavy armor strapped onto a soldier's body. When this same word becomes the primary word for God's own presence, it does not lose that root meaning. It intensifies it, scales it up past the size of any single human, until it becomes a presence so substantial it can fill an entire tent, occupy an entire temple, leave priests unable to stand, and flatten a prophet to the floor with nothing more than an overheard refrain about the whole earth. It is a presence the biblical writers insist can also leave, reluctantly, stage by stage, pausing on a mountainside to look back. And can also return, filling a rebuilt house the same deliberate way it once filled the first one. And, in the strangest turn of all, according to John, it is a presence that eventually took on ordinary flesh and moved into an ordinary neighborhood, letting itself be touched, fed, and eventually killed, without ceasing. Paul, writing to people in real and ongoing pain, reached for this same word one more time, and set it deliberately against lightness. Light affliction now, weighed against a glory too substantial to be measured by any comparison later. Every time the word glory appears in your English Bible from this point forward, there is a quiet invitation buried underneath the translation. To stop picturing a decorative shine hovering somewhere above the text, and to start feeling for the weight the original word was always carrying. Something too real, too substantial, too consequential to simply glance at and move past. It changes, too, how a reader might approach the ordinary instruction, scattered throughout Scripture, to give God glory, to render him Kavod. This was never primarily a request for compliments, the way a person might politely praise a piece of art. It is closer to an instruction to weigh him correctly, to stop treating the substance of who God is as something light, negligible, easily set aside in favor of whatever feels more urgent in a given, and to instead let that weight actually register, the way Isaiah's body registered it, the way the priests at Solomon's temple registered it when their legs simply would not carry them any further into the room. That is Kavod. Not radiance borrowed from the sun. Weight, carried all the way from a battlefield in the wilderness, into a tent, into a temple, into a prophet's collapsed body, into ordinary flesh, and finally, according to one apostle writing from the middle of his own suffering, into whatever is still waiting for you, on the other side of whatever feels unbearably light right now.